Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome to our first episode of our Chapter 14 lecture series. And our topic for this presentation is to introduce the primary brain regions. We are going to begin by looking at what is described as the brainstem. Now, it's named the brainstem because when you look at the brain, it's sort of like a lollipop. And this would be the stick or stem of the brain, right? And it also can be described as the primitive brain because it's really just responsible for processing those autonomic nervous system functions. It's got lots of different nuclei or control centers that are going to be regulating things like respiration rate and heart rate and blood pressure and digestive system function and these sorts of things. So very much controlling of the visceral functions. And so obviously this is all going to be, thank goodness, unconscious level processing. The information that comes to the brainstem can also be sent on to either the cerebrum or the cerebellum. So we'll be talking about these in turn as we go along. Notice too that the brainstem is continuous with the spinal cord. So let's get started with the bottom portion of the brainstem, which is the medulla oblongata. You can also refer to it by its division name, which you can see here in blue as the diencephalon. Now, the medulla oblongata is going to send sensory information to the thalamus, so that is one of its important jobs. It also has all of those autonomic nervous system functions, so it will regulate heart rate and blood pressure and digestion. Sitting sort of on top of the medulla oblongata, you have the pons, which is going to be anatomically and physiologically connected to the cerebellum. Now, when you look at both the pons and the cerebellum together, you'll see that they compose another division of the brain called the diencephalon. The pons contain somatic and visceral motor nuclei. So of course, nuclei refers to processing centers. And we also see respiratory control centers located here. So that's the control of your respiration rate. And then the top portion of the brainstem is called the midbrain. The midbrain can also be referred to by its division name, shown here in blue, the mesencephalon. The midbrain will have a few functions. It does process visual and auditory information. It's going to have some cranial reflexes. So when we talked about reflexes, we looked at examples of reflexes that were processed at the spinal cord, but we do have some processed here at the midbrain, so they would be referred to as cranial reflexes. If you hear a loud noise, you might turn your head in the direction of that sound, or if you see a flash of something in your peripheral vision, you may turn your head in the direction of that flash to get a better idea of what it is. So these are some examples of cranial reflexes being processed at those superior and inferior colliculi that you're studying as part of your lab work. The midbrain is also important in helping to maintain consciousness. So we're seeing that the brain stem itself is consisting of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Sitting on top of the brain stem, you have another division of the brain, which is referred to as the diencephalon. So the name in blue there, diencephalon, is the division. The structures that make up the diencephalon primarily are the hypothalamus and the thalamus. Now, there's not actually a line here in the brain. I've sort of drawn that in to give you an idea about the hypothalamus as sort of the floor of the diencephalon. Now, the hypothalamus is located in the brain. It does consist of neurons, but it also can be classified as part of the endocrine system. So what we'll see is the hypothalamus is going to be important in releasing hormones that can then have effects on emotion and also help to regulate autonomic functions. So hypothalamus jobs include regulation of body temperature, connecting the nervous and endocrine systems, as already stated. Subconscious or unconscious, you could use those words either way here, control of skeletal muscle during rage, pleasure, pain, or sexual arousal. And then also, we can see the hypothalamus involved in producing emotional and behavioral drives. The thalamus, really, we'll see it having the job of being a relay center for sensory information, directing it on to the processing center in the cerebrum. The hypothalamus and the thalamus are not the only structures in the diencephalon. We also see a gland called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is going to really be discussed heavily in the endocrine system. So while it's located in the brain, it's primarily an endocrine structure. So that means release of hormones. You have this little attachment tissue that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus, and that is referred to as the infundibulum. So you can see that labeled there. And then we also have another endocrine structure here, a gland called the pineal, which is located at the posterior portion of the diencephalon. The pineal gland is responsible for helping to establish circadian rhythm, so that's part of your sleep-wake cycle, and it does this with the release of melatonin when exposed to darkness. So you'll see that melatonin production slows or stops in the presence of light, and then it is released in the absence of light or in darkness. Okay, so we've mentioned the cerebellum already, but we've not talked a lot about it. The cerebellum is going to be the second largest portion of the brain. We will see it attached to the brainstem, specifically at the pons. And so we've already talked about these two structures as being anatomically and physiologically connected. Together, remember, they do compose the division called the diencephalon. Now, the cerebellum is going to have several jobs, one of which is the coordination of skeletal muscle movement. So I like to describe this as like muscle memory. So when you teach yourself how to walk, the memory of how to hold your body and coordinate your left and your right foot so that you don't fall down every time, you pretty much establish that around age 1 or so. And once you know it, you know it. And typically you don't have to learn that again unless you've had some serious brain injury. And so instead of having to think about how to physically walk, you can think about how fast or slow you want to walk. You can pay attention to the scenery. You can have a conversation with somebody else. You can think about, where you're going and how to get there and all that sort of thing. And so this would be an example of like muscle memory. So any kind of activities that we've taught our body, whether it's playing an instrument or athletics or drawing, any of these things would be kind of stored or coordinated by the cerebellum. Also, postural muscles, movements, that's pretty unconsciously unconsciously controlled. So I can consciously think, okay, I'm going to sit in my chair, and then cerebellum can do the work of like how to maintain myself in an upright position. The cerebellum then, in order to kind of coordinate these movements, does need to process some sensory information. So it's going to process sensory information described as proprioception, which we've mentioned briefly before. This is essentially our sensation of how our body is positioned in space. So you're going to get information from your synovial joints as well as your tendons, telling you how your muscles are positioned, and your ligaments telling you how your skeleton is positioned. We also see the cerebellum processing visual and auditory and balance and other tactile sensations, all of which we can imagine to be important in the coordination of our body movements. Alcohol does affect your cerebellar function, so this is one reason why balance can be extremely compromised, as well as other muscular coordination while inebriated. What's interesting to me is, We've been studying humans for a very long time, and the cerebellum is kind of a new area of research. So there's some new research that came out earlier in October of 2018. That's like, hey, the cerebellum is even cooler than we first thought. So, all of the time we've talked about the cerebellum as being important in coordinating muscular movements, but the new data suggests that only about 20% of the functions of the cerebellum are with these coordination of muscle movements, and then 80% would be basically kind of doing the same kind of coordination task, but for higher order cognition. So the cerebellum itself is not doing the abstract thinking or the planning or the holding memories or the kind of producing of words, but rather sort of smoothing out or coordinating those higher level functionings from the cerebrum. So when you consider the cerebellum having this role in like graceful actions of the body, muscle movements of the body, think too maybe about the cerebellum as providing this sort of grace to our higher order thinking skills as well. So I've heard it described as editing thoughts or editing our internal life, smoothing out our emotions. Basically, like the muscle memory, but for higher order thinking. If you're still kind of having trouble, what would that mean? Go back to the idea of alcohol inhibiting cerebral function. Not only do you lose your balance and your physical coordination, also your mental coordination, right? Your problem solving and thought processes and so forth are impaired, and that might be related to cerebral function. So this is an interesting new area of research. Okay, and then finally what we need to look at is, of course, the cerebrum. So this is the lollipop of the brain, right? This is the largest portion of the brain. This is where all higher order, higher level thought processing is occurring. This is our conscious level processing. We're going to see that the cerebrum is responsible for our intellect and our learning and our memory and our planning and complex movements and all this sort of thing. The cerebrum will have its own presentation, so stay tuned.